Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents God is Not Dead, What Quantum Physics Tells Us About Our Origins and How We Should Live, by Amit Goswami, Ph.D. Narrated by Runnette. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type God is Not Dead into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code FAITH, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Preface. Can the question of God's existence be settled by scientific evidence? In this book, I show that it can, and it already has, in God's favor. But the evidence is subtle, based on the concept of the primacy of consciousness from quantum physics, which remains Greek to many people, and so the message is very slow to penetrate both scientific and popular consciousness. This book attempts to accelerate the acceptance of God once again in our society and our culture. One question needs to be settled at the outset. What is the God that science is rediscovering? Everyone knows that even religious people who talk the most about God cannot agree about what God is. So, is science rediscovering a Christian God, a Hindu God, a Muslim God, a Buddhist God, a Judaic God, or a God of a less popular religion? The answer is crucial. What almost everyone doesn't know is that at the esoteric core of all the great religions, there is much agreement about the nature of God. Even at the popular level, most religions agree about three fundamental aspects of God. First, God is an agent of causation, over and above causation arising from the material world. Second, there are more subtle levels of reality than the material level. And third, there are godlike qualities, love is a primary one, that religions teach people to aspire to as a major goal. What is the God that science is rediscovering? Suffice it to say, for now, that the God rediscovered by science has all three of these important aspects. I offer two kinds of scientific evidence for God. The first kind I label as the quantum signatures of the divine. Quantum physics gives us such novel aspects of reality, the quantum signatures, that to understand, explain, and appreciate them, we are forced to introduce the God hypothesis. An example is quantum non-locality, signal-less communication. Ordinary local communication is carried out via signals carrying energy. But in 1982, Alain Aspect and his collaborators verified in the laboratory the existence of communications requiring no signals. Hitherto, the belief was that such quantum signatures occur only in the submicroscopic world of matter, and somehow are not important for the macro domain or mundane level of reality. But I demonstrate that these quantum signatures also occur at this level, and that they provide indisputable evidence for the existence of God. Research groups conducting experiments with several kinds of phenomena have found such evidence in the laboratory. The second kind of evidence involves what religions call subtle domains of reality. You could very easily label this kind of evidence as pertaining to impossible problems requiring impossible solutions, from the materialist point of view, that is. An example will make this clear. Recently there's been a lot of controversy about creationism, intelligent design theories versus evolutionism. Why so much controversy? It is because even after 150 years of Darwinism, evolutionists do not have a foolproof theory. They cannot satisfactorily explain either the fossil data, specifically the fossil gaps, or why and how life appears to be so intelligently designed. This is what creates room for controversy. Honest, unprejudiced scientific appraisal of these theories and data shows what follows. Neither Darwinism nor its later synthesis with genetics and population biology, called neo-Darwinism, agrees with all the experimental data. Creationism and intelligent design theories, as proposed, have little scientific content, with creationism having hardly any scientific content. But there is indisputable data supporting the fundamental ideas of both evolution and intelligent design, although not Bible-based creationism. The key here is to ask, is there an alternative to both of these approaches that agrees with all the data? My answer is yes, and I will demonstrate it in this book. But this requires the existence of a causally empowered God and a subtle body that acts as a blueprint for biological form. Materialism permits neither of these. Nevertheless, impossible problems require impossible solutions. Another example involves the processing of meaning. The philosopher John Searle and the physicist Roger Penrose have shown that computers can process only symbols, not the meaning that the symbols may represent. For generating and processing meaning, we need the mind. But then the question arises, how does the mind interact with matter? The age-old dualism problem of the mind-body interaction still haunts us. This is where I show that the God hypothesis is essential to settle the mind-body interaction problem, and in this new, impossible context, our creative ability to process new meaning gives us much tangible scientific evidence for the existence of God. If the good news is that such evidence for God is already here, then what should we do about it? Well, first, we must reformulate our sciences within the quantum God hypothesis and demonstrate its usefulness outside of quantum physics. In this book, I demonstrate that this one hypothesis solves all the hitherto unsolved mysteries of biology, the nature and origin of life, fossil gaps of evolution, why evolution proceeds from simple to complex systems, and why biological beings have feeling and, mysteriously, consciousness, just to mention a few. We also find that within the quantum God hypothesis, the depth psychology of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and James Hillman, based on the unconscious, is seen as quite complementary to the height psychology of the humanists and transpersonalists of recent times, Carl Rogers, Roberto Assagioli, Abraham Maslow, and Ken Wilber, based on transcendence or superconsciousness. Both these psychologies are now recognized as defining paths to the realization of God in our personal lives. There are other aspects of the quantum God hypothesis that every one of us can appreciate and even bring to fruition. This new science validates our current preoccupation with meaning, although the materialist worldview is doing its best to undermine it. Equally important is that a God-based science puts ethics and values where they belong, at the centers of our lives and societies. We may not like some aspects of the old religions that hitherto were the only proponents of the concept of God, but we can agree that all religions gave us ethics and values, the cultivation of godliness, for our societies. These have been undermined by the current materialist worldview, with devastating results for our politics, economics, businesses, and education. With the scientific rediscovery of God, which also emphasizes ethics and values, we gain an opportunity to revitalize modern social systems like democracy and capitalism that seem to have become bogged down with seemingly insurmountable difficulties. The preoccupation with meaning, ethics, and values is important for the evolution of humanity. My final message is what I call quantum activism, combining the usual activism of changing the world with ongoing efforts to align oneself with the evolutionary movement of the whole. If the latter step requires our creativity and quantum leaps in our processing of meaning and values while engaged in the affairs of the world, so be it. At the least, this will bring new meaning and value to our lives. At best, it will usher a new age of enlightenment. I acknowledge with deeply felt gratitude all the people who have contributed to the rediscovery of God, which is the subject of this book. The names are too many to list, with one exception, my wife, Uma, who is also my partner in my current spiritual practice. I also thank all the quantum activists who have worked with me in the past or are currently working with me, and also those who will undertake quantum activism in the future. Finally, I thank my editors, Bob Friedman and John Nelson, and the staff of Hampton Roads for a fine production job on this book. Prologue. For Skeptics. Before presenting this book to you, dear listener, I asked myself what the reaction would be to the basic idea of this book from three types of die-hard skeptics: the materialist scientist, the Western philosopher, and last but not least, the Christian theologian. So I decided to do an exercise employing active imagination to address the skepticism of these three groups head-on. In my imagination, I create my straw scientist. He's a white American male, complete with coat and tie loosened at the neck to signify openness, a touch of the eminent American physicist Richard Feynman. He has an air of all-knowing nonchalance and a lighted cigar in hand, emulating the celebrated Danish physicist Niels Bohr. And, of course, he has the impatient, arrogant smile of the American biologist James Watson, intended to hide his forever-present insecurity. I then ask my scientist, I am planning to present a book about the scientific evidence for God. What do you think of the idea? Not much, he says, not too surprisingly. He elaborates, look, we've heard such claims of scientific evidence before. Take the creationists, for example. For all the noise they make, when you look closely, all their evidence is based on the negatives of our argument. They are clever, I admit. They do make many interesting points about the holes in the Darwinian evolutionary theory, our antidote to their so-called creation science. But we've countered by pointing out that their ideas don't constitute science because they're not verifiable. He gives me a challenging look and continues, look, I know you want to make a case for God by highlighting all the shortcomings of materialist science and explaining things, but that will never work. This is not an important part of my approach, but I'm curious. But why? Why? His smile now becomes condescending. Because, my idealistic friend, we can always address our negatives by the promise of future scientific discoveries. The answers are blowing in the wind of future science. I know. I, too, can be condescending. Didn't Karl Popper denigrate that, calling it promissory materialism? His cigar has gone out, and he becomes busy relighting it. He takes a long puff and spews out a cloud of smoke. Now he gives me a penetrating look, like he's ready to level me with his reply. What is God? He asks presently. But I am ready for him. I say with quiet confidence, God is the agent of downward causation. Oh, that hackneyed answer, he pooh-poohs. I thought you'd have something better. We eliminated that God long ago, because it's dualism. How does a non-material God dish out downward causation that affects material objects? Any interaction with the material world takes an exchange of energy, but the energy of the material world alone is always conserved. No energy ever flows out to God or comes in from God. How is it possible that God is always interacting with the world? You didn't let me finish, and you didn't let me finish, he continues. Look here, we don't deny that you feel the presence of an almighty God in your religious rituals, but we have an explanation. God is a brain phenomenon. When you tickle certain centers of the midbrain with your rituals, you elicit experiences of a powerful force. Downward causation makes sense to you then. Okay? Not okay. I can also be firm. God is the agent of downward causation, but it doesn't have to be the dualistic God of old. Your problem is that since Galileo you've been fighting the straw God of popular Christianity, which isn't the real issue at all. The real issue is, can your model of reality, with one material level of existence and upward causation from the base level of matter, figure 1-1, account for everything? And it can't. You have to face up to that. Christians of the old tradition tried to explain everything they could not understand with the general principle, God and his downward causation. It's a very limited idea. Science was developed to fight that idea and to discover better ways for understanding the data. Today, you materialist scientists are doing the same thing. With any unexplainable phenomenon, you either deny it or try to explain it away with worn-out concepts like God is an emergent epiphenomenon of the brain, or God is a useful adaptation under the Darwinian struggle for survival. We can never verify such ideas. You are lecturing me, he grumbles gruffly. So you lectured me, I am stern. The God I'm talking about is quantum consciousness. As you know very well, in quantum physics, objects aren't determined things. Instead, they are possibilities for God, quantum consciousness, to choose from. God's choosing transforms the quantum possibilities into actual events experienced by an observer. Surely you accept the idea that quantum consciousness is scientific? Yes, of course. The observer effect. Quantum objects are seemingly affected by conscious observers or by consciousness. Then he smiles slyly. New wine in an old bottle, eh? Trying to make the idea of quantum consciousness provocative by renaming it as God? He is not getting the point. Look, I am quite serious. Quantum consciousness is really what our savants, the mystics, have meant by the word God. I begin my exposition proving that, and also pointing out that it's an experimentally verifiable idea. He interrupts me. Really? Look, the observership is just an appearance, and there must be a material explanation for this appearance. It's too hasty to postulate real consciousness. He sounds a little exasperated. But it's logically consistent to assume so. To do otherwise gives you a paradox. Yes, but we can't let a few paradoxes get in the way of our philosophical convictions, he says slyly. He is not getting the point. Look, I'm quite serious. I repeat that quantum consciousness is really what our mystics have meant by the word God. Let me also repeat that it is an experimentally verifiable idea. He now hears me, and his mouth falls open. Really? How? Look, ever since the physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace told Napoleon, I don't need that God hypothesis for my theories, you guys have been using that argument to disprove God. And successfully, too, my scientist interrupts. Yes, but now turnabout is fair play. I'll present theoretical paradoxes and experimental data to show that we do need the God hypothesis, and not only to remove logical paradoxes from our theories, but also to explain much new data. Brace yourself. My scientist looks away. I know I've gotten to him. Scientists respect resolution of paradoxes, and most of all, experimental data. But my scientist comes around and slyly says, surely you don't expect us to lay aside our convictions just because of a few paradoxes. And as for new data, it's a bit speculative to say that quantum physics, designed for the micro world, also works for the macro or mundane world. This is what you're implying, isn't it? I suppose next you're going to tell me that this has already been verified by objective experiments in the macro world. I smile. That's exactly what I'm telling you. As to the applicability of quantum physics to the macro world, surely you know about squid. My scientist grins. Squid. My wife sometimes serves it for dinner. I can't say I like it very much. I shake my head. You know that SQUID is the acronym for superconducting quantum interference devices. It's too technical to delve into it here, but those experiments showed long ago that quantum physics applies all the way to the macro world, as it should. Also, the God-verifying experiments I will discuss in this book are all macro-level experiments. Some of the new data has even been replicated. My scientist looks a little uncomfortable. Look here, we are never going to accept what you're doing as science. You know why? Because science, by definition, looks for natural explanations, you're inviting something supernatural, God, into this hypothesis. It can never be science. He sounds stubborn. If by nature you mean the space-time-matter world, then your science cannot even accommodate quantum physics. Shame on you. The Aspect experiment, photons affecting one another without signals through space and time, settled that issue once and for all. My scientist again looks away. His cigar has very conveniently gone out again. I get up. I know I've gotten to him. Scientists respect objective experiments. 1 down, the materialist scientist. 2 to go. In my imagination, I now create the skeptic philosopher, tall, white American male with a shaved head and looking a lot like Ken Wilber. I tell him about my book on the scientific evidence for the existence of God. I also tell him about my encounter with the skeptical scientist. He surprises me with his question. What is science? I fumble with words a bit. We have ideas about being through our experience of the outer and the inner worlds and through our intuitions. These constitute our philosophy of being that you philosophers call ontology or metaphysics. Next comes how we know being, which you philosophers call epistemology, right? The scientists intuitively theorize about being, make deductions from various theoretical insights, and then subject the theories to experimental consensus verification. Science is an epistemology with 2 wings, theory and experiment. I look at him for approval. He says gruffly, Fine, fine. But what you study and discover through this science is about manifest experience, ephemeral, wouldn't you say? He is right. I nod in agreement. Then tell me, how can you use this science of temporal phenomena, space-bound phenomena, to prove the existence of what is eternal, what is beyond all phenomena, what is transcendent? Your idea is worse than those of the medieval Christians who tried to prove God's existence through reason because of your scientific pretentiousness. You think people will accept your idea because you cloak it in science, don't you? This fellow is arrogant, also cynical. I try to respond, but he continues in a staccato voice. I know of your kind of scientific proof of God. You managed to do it not only by redefining God, but by even redefining materialism. You're a holist, right? Actually, I am not a holist. Not the usual kind who thinks that the whole is greater than its parts, or that novel creations can emerge from simple components but cannot be reduced to them. But his question has perked my curiosity. So, what have you got against the holists? He looks at me scornfully. Look, even as Descartes understood 400 years ago, matter is fundamentally reductionistic. The microcosm makes up the macrocosm. To suggest that matter in bulk, because of complexity, can have novel emergent features is preposterous. You think God is an emergent interconnectedness of matter, and God's downward causation is an emergent causal principle of complex matter. But this kind of idea is easily refuted. He pauses, looking at me for a reaction. I remain quiet. He continues. If the idea of emergent holism held water, it would show up whenever we make complex matter out of the simple. For example, when hydrogen and oxygen mingle together to make a water molecule, does any property emerge that cannot be predicted from the interaction of these constituents? No. And if you say that the wetness of water, which we can feel, is such an emergent property, I'll hit you. Our feeling of the wetness of water comes from our interaction with the water molecule. I try to mollify him. I'm not saying that anything new or holistic emerges when hydrogen and oxygen combine to make water. Actually, I agree with you. The holists walk on very thin ice. He does not seem to hear what I said, and continues, If God were only an emergent interconnectedness of matter, God would be time-bound and space-bound, limited. There would be no transcendence, no sudden enlightenment, and no spiritual transformation. You can call the holist view deep ecology, garb it with the fancy names that satisfy mediocre minds, but it does not satisfy the philosophically astute. It does not satisfy me. Again, his arrogance is showing, and in this case he is right, of course, on his basic point. I try to be patient and exclaim, "Oh, great philosopher, you are right. Holism is a hopeless approach of the fence-straddling philosopher who values God but won't give up materialism entirely. And you are right that science can never find answers about the ultimate truth. Truth is. But behold, please, materialists make the ontological assertion that matter is the reductionist ground of all being. Everything, even consciousness, can be reduced to material building blocks, the elementary particles and their interactions. They hold that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a secondary phenomenon of matter that is the primary reality. What I demonstrate is the necessity of turning the materialist science upside down. Quantum physics demands that science be based on the primacy of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of all being, a being that mystics call Godhead. Let materialists realize that it is matter that is the epiphenomenon, not consciousness. I see. My philosopher is unruffled. That all sounds very noble. But now haven't you gone too far the other way? Can you call it science if you base it on the primacy of consciousness? The way I see it, scientists can look at the objective side of consciousness, the it and its, the third-person aspect of consciousness, so to speak. The mystics, indeed all of us, personally, look at the subjective side, the first-person experience. The philosopher can do even better, by considering the intersubjective side, the second-person relationship aspect. This is what I call the 1, 2, 3, the first-person, second-person, and third-person aspects of consciousness. If we extend consciousness study from the purely scientific objective to include the other aspects as well, we get a complete model, the 4-quadrant model. Figure 3.1. The problem of consciousness is solved. We don't need quantum physics and your new paradigm thinking about science. I'm a little startled by his claims. This fellow is tough in his own way. Nevertheless, I managed to say, "That's real good. It describes the phenomenon as phenomenology. This is impeccable." But the model does not integrate the 4 quadrants. He smugly retorts, "That is precisely my point, and that of the mystic. To integrate, you have to go beyond science, beyond reason, into higher states of consciousness." Now it is my turn to be tough. This is an elitist position, and you know it. Mystics have always said that in order to know reality it takes higher states of consciousness, and then they say to whoever listens, "Be good, because I have experienced these higher states and I know what is good for you." But has this ploy ever worked? It works to some extent because being good is part of our nature, hence the appeal of religions. But base emotions are also part of our nature, hence materialism also appeals to us. And this mysticism-materialism debate goes on, in public and in private. So what are you proposing? Quantum physics enables us to develop a dynamic integration of spiritual metaphysics and the science of the material world. It retains the mystery of mysticism, of the ultimate reality, but it allows reason to penetrate deep enough to understand the integrity of your 1, 2, 3 of consciousness, I say gravely. The philosopher is now respectful. How does that quantum redefinition of science help establish God so scientists and everyone else will accept the idea and try to be good, he asks. Remember my dialogue with the scientist? I can feel I have his full attention now. God is quantum consciousness. This is a level below the absolute level of consciousness as the ground of all being. Scientific objectives and experimental tests can be engaged at this level, not to test God directly, but to test God's power of downward causation that manifests not only the material world but also the subtle levels. We are also finding solid objective data for the existence of the subtle. It is this objective experimental...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?